Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the library. Thank you for coming today. My name is Troy Swanson. I'm the library department chair, and we are excited to kick off our second annual graphic novel symposium, where we talk about comic books and art and graphic novels and games and other geeky kind of stuff, which is fun, but also connects to our curriculum and to learning, which is our ultimate goal. We are excited to, I should mention, I want to thank Espresso Love, our coffee bar. They're offering support to make today possible. So go and buy some coffee when you're done, or a sandwich or something, thanks to them. So we're excited today to welcome Adam Fotos to talk to us about his process. Adam does graphic novels. He's published several books. He has a bachelor's, a BFA, from the University of Tennessee, where he studied painting. And he has a MFA, Master of Fine Arts, from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, where he studied painting and sculpture. He's a full-time faculty member at Chicago State University. And I've purchased, I have one of his novels and read with my kids, and it was a huge hit in my house. So I'm like, this guy's got to come and talk. So here we are, Adam, to talk about building comics. Oh, I should mention his strip, which is known, one of his comic strips, Dragon and Goat, ran for 4 years at U of I in the Daily Illini, and 1 year at University of Tennessee, so folks often know him around from that work. So with that, thank you, Adam, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Troy. Can everybody hear me in the back? You guys are okay? All right, thanks for having me. Really glad Troy invited me, and really happy to be here for the second graphic novel symposium. So I'm going to talk about, like Troy said, my process, some of my comics, and hopefully give you guys some ideas if you're interested in making comics, like how to approach it from small comics to big projects. Like you said, I've been doing comics for a while, so it's about 12 years ago I started my comic strip Dragon and Goat, and it ran as a daily newspaper strip. So 5 days a week for about 5 years I was making the comic, and that was really good practice for sharpening my comicking skills. I grew up really devouring comics, either in newspapers or in graphic novels. And now, after getting out of school for a while, I've really been throwing myself into making comics. So just wanted to share with you guys some ideas I had to launch you on your own comic making. Now, to sort of frame the conversation, I've been thinking about how you make a comic, and thinking about how making a comic is a lot like building a building, creating architecture. So whether you're working on a one-shot mini webcomic or an epic graphic novel, the process of making an original work, it can be really daunting. But comics, like anything that you might build, can be made easier if you break things down rather than getting caught up in the final product. So don't get too caught up in creating this great book at the end, but really think about, what are the steps to get you to that final product. Like any edifice, a comic has to be constructed from the ground up, requiring an architect, an engineer, a contractor, a construction crew, interior decorator, and even a real estate agent. In mainstream comics, like superhero comics or other sort of popular comics, a lot of these jobs are divided up into multiple people, multiple staff on the crew. But for independent comics like what I do, that's usually between 1 or 2 people. So we have to be in comics, in independent comics, the workhorse. So really, really want to think about like how you're sort of assembling all these different skills from writing to creating the art. Now, at the beginning stages, a lot of times we can get caught up in non-essential elements, or at least what I think of being non-essential elements to start with. Thinking too much maybe about the aesthetic qualities or the appearances of specific characters, creating elaborate costume designs, or spending hours mapping out the worlds for the characters. You may spend 3 or 4 days constructing great weaponry for your characters to carry around, but really none of these aesthetic ideas are going to play out unless you actually have a good story. You want to think about how these comics really rely on creating something that the characters can play out on, that these different elements, these costumes, can sort of populate. You want to think about creating a story that connects with the audience. Particularly in the graphic novel, narrative is at the heart of the work, or to keep the building conceit going, the hearth, right? So the story is the sort of nugget from which all the comics should grow. So today, we're not going to talk a lot about character design or how to draw really good characters, but rather how to create the blueprints and structure for your visual narratives. So my first bit of advice is to think small. Start with something tiny rather than a skyscraper. You have to make it, so you have a great idea for a graphic novel. That's great, but put the brakes on it. Give yourself some time to warm up with some smaller works. You might take on a one-page comic, thinking about how you can tell a small story with one of your characters. Or you might start with a small zine. So just a small book, maybe like 8 to 12 pages, that can sort of give your characters life, but not sort of daunt you with a tremendous amount of work. So more than likely, when you start off, your work won't be as strong as it will be compared to your work in 5 years. So you want to think about pacing yourself. You don't have to be a comic star right out of the gate. So you can save your big ideas once you've gotten your feet wet with a few smaller works. Now, I'm not going to assume that everybody has a great idea for a graphic novel at this point. So if you're interested in comics, but you don't really know where to start, I've got a few ideas for some short comics exercises that I use a lot in classes that you might sort of take home with you and think about making your own work. So the first of these is simply eavesdropping on conversations. So you can go to a public place. The library is a great place for this as long as people are allowed to talk. Bus stops work great if you go to the mall. So anywhere where you can sort of listen in on a complete stranger. Now, it's a little creepy, but if you have a notepad, pretend you're doing something else, and you could just write down word for word what the people are saying. So you can use that as a starting point for a script that you can then use to build the visuals from. Now, you might do directly from the people who are talking. Maybe you do a quick sketch of them. Or you could see what happens when you take the script and you replace it with completely different characters. If the person on the bus suddenly becomes a giant robot, how does that change the tone of the conversation? So that can be a really good project, but doing it in just one page. And this is an example of a comic, an overheard conversation. And a lot of comics artists use this. We hear really good things that people say, just snatching them out of the ether and then putting them into our comic can be a good way for those conversations or just snippets of information to have new life. Another exercise I like to use in classes is, and I actually do this myself, is keeping a dream journal. Depending on how you dream, some people say that they don't remember their dreams when they wake up, but you can always try to sort of hold on to those images that you see in your sleep. It's not that they have to be stories, but you want to try to capture some of the things that your imagination is coming with without your sort of intellectual or analytical input. So if you start a dream journal, you can record all these images that you see and then start to see how those images, those stories might fit into an actual comic. There are several artists who actually do this. Jim Woodring is one of them, and he does the comic Frank. And he also does autobiographical comics that he has himself sort of, he draws himself sort of wandering through these dream worlds that he's dreaming up. Now, if you're one of those people who says, I don't really remember my dreams, well, if you just start writing down just a little bit of the things that you remember when you wake up, the more you do this, like if you try to keep it up like every day, the more you do it, the more you'll start to remember, and your brain will start to realize, oh, these dreams are kind of important. And I use these quite a bit in my own dreams for just coming up with different brainstorming activities for myself. If I don't know what to do, like for a comic, I might just pull an image from my dreams and just start drawing it. And it might not become something that I eventually sell or a book, but it at least starts me drawing and starts me thinking about other ideas. And that's the basic idea of these exercises, just to keep you either drawing or writing, and then as you're doing it, as you're sort of in the process of making, sometimes those big ideas really spark. So another exercise is mining your personal history. So looking back on where you've been, the life that you've led, and your experiences. And it doesn't mean that you have to have leapt off tall buildings in a single bound within your real life, but think about your everyday experiences. And even mundane things like making pancakes can be turned into profound things if you really sit with it for a while and think about what these experiences mean and what do they mean when they're actually put into a comic. So for this example, this is Alison Bechtel, and she's a great artist who mines her own personal history. She created the graphic memoir. I think she calls it a tragicomic fun home. And it's a great work. You may have heard of it. It's been in the news a little bit lately because Duke University just picked it up as their required freshman reading. And there was a big stink about it because it deals with her sexuality and also her father's sexuality growing up with him. But it's a great graphic memoir to pick up. And it's works like these that have sort of inspired me to take on the autobiographical format as well. So I do some funny animal comic strips like Dragon and Goat, and then also another web comic, Cloud Arcadia. And these are like pretty fantastical, humorous comics, not too much based in the real world. But I've also been, over the past couple years, thinking about how can I put myself into my own work, and what does that mean? With Dragon and Goat, it's a comic about a dragon and goat, but people ask me where the idea comes from. And for the most part, dragon and goat are inside of me, right? They're different aspects of me. In this comic, I'm being maybe a little bit more literal and putting myself in the comic. So my latest autobiographical work is Beyond Paper Walls, and these are a couple pages from that. It's a black and white comic, and it follows me and my wife as we went to Japan a couple years ago. And in the comic, we're sort of going around a mountain in Kyoto. It's the Fushimi Inari mountain where they have the giant like orange tories. And so we're sort of walking around the mountain, but I'm using this kind of as an excuse to talk about the differences between the Japan that I imagined before I went to the actual place. And so sort of juggling the imaginary and the real in the comic. Now, for this comic, so if you are kind of interested in autobiographical comics, it's a pretty long history of this in comics history since the 60s with the underground comics that were using a lot of personal stories from R. Crumb to Harvey Pekar. And so there's sort of a long tradition of this. These are not the most marketable comics. I'm not really creating this comic to sell to people, but just to get my ideas out there. So if you have an idea that you think might not fit in like a mainstream market, don't kill it. There are lots of other ways that you can make a living as a comics artist, or at least make your work where you're not actually surviving off your book sales. Because if you talk to any publisher, the publishing market is really not doing so well. So you have to figure out other ways to make your work happen. Kickstarter is a good way to fund a small print of your books, and also Patreon is another way to sort of have people crowdfund your work. For this publication, what I've done is gotten a grant from the city of Chicago, the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. They're funding the publication of a small run of the books, and actually I'm doing them with Kraken Print, and those guys are going to be here in the afternoon to talk about small press and how you can publish your own books. So if you can't get in with like the mainstream publishers, it shouldn't be the end of the world for you. I haven't been published by any mainstream publishers, and I've been doing this for about 12 years. So there's definitely viable ways of putting your work out there independently. If you have to though, really take on a lot more work in terms of marketing and getting yourself out there. All right, so the final exercise that I'm going to give you is the random comic generator, and this is something that I've been using for like teaching, over the past like 6 or so years, and you can't really see it on the screen, so hopefully you've got one of these handy. And you guys can take these home and use these to generate some comics if you want. So the idea is that you take a 20-sided die, and you roll it 4, 5, or 6 times. You're going to take the number that you get, and then you choose the column, or you go by the column for each roll of the die, and then you're going to choose that thing to have in an actual comic. So those are going to be your core ingredients, and then you just have to let your brain think, how can a story evolve from this? So we're going to do this together today. So what I want to do is we're going to roll. We're going to go to the document cam and see what we get for the ingredients for the comic that we're going to make. All right, so we got a 2. So can somebody give me what the first column is, number 2? So I think this is going to be our first character. What is it? Vampire. All right, so we got vampire. Okay, and then the second column, what do we get for 3? What is it? A jar from the second column? Jar. Okay, we got a jar. All right, we're going to do one more. 19 from the third column. Shopping. Okay, shopping. And then from the fourth column, 2. Troll? Okay, we've got a troll. Or is it troll? Is it a verb or is it a noun, you think? So it's under the characters, right? So an actual troll, not trolling. Okay, so this is what we're going to start with for our comic, and we're going to come back to this in a second. So as you're starting off, I like this quote from Romare Bearden, an artist who dealt a lot with like collage and borrowing from his own history in his work. And his suggestion is for the artist to be a whale. And I think this is good advice for the comics artist as well. So being a whale in that you're absorbing everything. You take everything in around you. Say yes to all these ideas that you're going to get. Don't say no to anything at the starting point. Just sort of absorb everything. Keep an open mind and really listen to the world around you. Don't be confined to maybe the comics that you typically read. Look for other comics. Go to the library. I'm sure here we've got a lot of different comics that you might not pick up. You know, if you're going to a comic book shop that maybe have more story and less capes. So keep an open mind in terms of looking at comics, in terms of looking at literature and looking at art, and think about, you know, what can you bring to the comics world that nobody else has really thought of yet. Now, once you've gotten through a few of these short exercises and maybe you've churned out a few one-page comics or, you know, a couple zines on your own, you might think about creating a longer graphic novel. So these are a couple images from my graphic novel, The Panopticorn. And this came out, I think, about 2011. And it took me about 3 years to create. I took a break from Dragon and Goat and focused just on this book. It's about 145 pages. And it took a while. Now, for 3 years of work, I was a little concerned about nobody hearing from me for 3 years. And so to keep up with my audience, rather than releasing small bits of the comic along the way, I decided to start my other comic and release it weekly on the web, Cloud Arcadia. So this allowed me to stay in touch with my audience on a weekly basis so that people knew that I hadn't either gone into hibernation or died, but that I was still making work. And this can be really important. You don't want to just hide for 3 years and come out like a cicada releasing books, because we have really short memories. People will forget about you. So you got to think about ways to engage your audience through this long process of crafting a longer book. Some ways of doing this that when I was making this I wish I had thought of, but other people have done, is to work simply in chapters, thinking about how the longer narratives that you're making could be constructed into smaller snippets, maybe 10 or 12 pages that you could release online. And this can be a really good way to drum up new fans for your work. So as you're going along, you release chapter by chapter. Maybe you hide the first chapter as you're moving. And then when you finally get all of it constructed, you release your book. So this can be a really good method for doing this. Other people, as they're creating their work, they take process shots. So maybe if you're drawing lots of pencils, sketches for your storyboarding, then you might take some images of those and like upload them, or have yourself drawing at your drawing table and showing shots of that, or your inks. So it can really be helpful to just think about your audience as you're creating these longer works. So another place that can be really good to start is thinking about your characters. And we really want to think about comics in terms of how they are character-driven stories. So many of us, if you're starting off and you haven't started creating your own books, you might already be drawing a lot of cartoon characters, but you don't necessarily know how to use them. So the nice thing about comics, unlike a building, is that you don't necessarily have to have a really solid blueprint before you get started. If you've got some characters, just go ahead and use them, draw some panels, or if you look on the back of the random comic generator, you've got some panels there. You can just start drawing the characters into these, and sometimes it can be really good for just to have a story emerge from the process of drawing. This is how I worked a lot with Dragon and Goat when I had to come up with 5 strips a week while I was still in school. It was a lot of pressure to meet the deadline, and so to come up with ideas on Sunday before the newspaper actually needed them, I just drew as furiously as I could until a story emerged out of those drawings. So think about how you can use your characters as building blocks. Focus on the relationships between the characters, not just on how they look. If you've got one hero in the story, don't focus just on the hero, but think about how the other characters exist in the narrative. How do they all fit together? We want to really think about avoiding flat characters. And with flat characters, these are characters that don't change throughout the story. So you want to think about, how do your characters change? How do they transform? From page 1 to the end of the book, how are the characters going to develop? So with flat characters, we're thinking about drawing on stereotypes. Those characters might be generic or simple, and they're not going to show any sort of change. So to avoid that, think about how you can create a unique character. This is going to require you to really think about, well, what characters are already out there? How is yours similar to that character, and how is yours different? Think about the level of complexity with which you're building your character. You have maybe one cool idea for a drawing, but then think about, what is that character doing on an everyday basis? And then just really think about how the characters progress and change through the story. The characters aren't just mindlessly marching through the events that you hand out to them, but think about how those events transform how they think, how they plan for the future. So how can you build your characters in layers? Well, investigate those characters' inner life. Ask yourself these questions. So what do they do when they're bored? How do they handle flight or fight situations? If they're presented with a challenge, do they just run away, or do they try to fight their way through it? What are their faults, their strengths? What secrets does she keep? So what is going to be hidden from your reader rather than shown right off the beginning? What are your characters' daydreams, or what are their nightmares? What do they obsess over, or what do they completely ignore? So as you're thinking about the character, their history, or their sort of inner life, you want to think about their history as well. So as they've been going through this imaginary world that you're creating for them, what traumas have they experienced? Do they have any significant relationships that have transformed them, that have changed them as people or as pigeons, depending on what your characters are? So think about what you can draw from their culture, their economic influences in their lives, how they've had successes or massive failures. These are the things that shape us, who we are as people, and you should think about how they shape your characters as well. Now, as you're building the history for your character, you want to always think about how, as you're playing out your story, you can hide your cards. You don't want to always tell your reader everything from page one. If you've got an elaborate history written out for your character, that's great. You can come up with a lot of great stories from writing that out. But you shouldn't think about telling it in the comic directly right out of the gate. You want to think about how you can hide that history and think about how it influences their navigation through the story you're creating for their now in the comic. Now later on, you might have snippets sort of show up in other panels, flashback panels, or going back in time or into the future. But really, think about how you can layer your comic so that it seems more rich, so that the characters have more life and the story has more to draw on. The analogy of the iceberg is really good. Your character should only be shown as the very tip of the iceberg. The viewer should only see that part of the character's life, but then, like an iceberg, the mass of the chunk of ice is under the water. And that's what you should know as the creator. You should know who the character is, how they think, and how their past has influenced them. It can be tempting with a lot of mainstream comics where we don't see characters change a lot to make these static characters that we're creating for over 30 or 40 years. They don't seem to change at all. We can look at The Simpsons, and sure, the drawings got a little better from the start to now, but the characters are pretty much in the same age. They're sort of frozen in time. It doesn't have to be the case for all comics. For this one, we've got Frank King and Gasoline Alley, where he takes characters and he actually ages them through the comic strip. So we see characters get older. He finds a child who becomes a very sort of key character in the comic who gradually grows up. So showing growth and development can be really important to creating a more developed narrative. So once you've got your characters, you've got some histories built, so how do you come up with stories? If you haven't, at this point, figured out what you want to tell with your characters, think about these four things. These are what are going to drive your narratives for the most part. Thinking about the characters' desires. How does what they want get them in trouble? What about their choices? If they want something, how do they go about getting it? Do they have two paths and they always choose the wrong path? And then we want to think too about conflict, and I've actually got these slides mixed up, right? So obviously the lightning bolt one is for conflict. So the fork in the road is for choices. So you want to think about these different things that the characters have with them. Are they going to be fighting? So thinking about those relationships. How do characters resolve conflict? Do they have fisticuffs, or do they talk out their problems? And then you want to always think about unexpected results. The character may have an idea of what the end game will be as they make a choice to resolve a conflict, but then how does something unexpected occur? And so just sort of walk through different scenarios with your characters and you'll figure out a story. You want to also think about who the reader is going to be. So who's going to be your audience for your characters? When I started out Dragon and Goat, it was at a university paper. So I was thinking about a university college student audience for the strip. The characters are pretty cute, pretty cuddly, but they also used a little bit, not too much, but a little bit of profanity. So when I went to comic book conventions, and at least my first ones, I had to sort of respond to who was actually picking up my books. And for the most part, the cute and cuddly Dragon and Goat was picked up by kids. So then I had to answer the question, or I had to ask the parents when they were buying the book, is it kid friendly? And I had to ask them, well, how do you feel about the word bastard? So if they were not too keen on it, then I had to make sure to let them know that it's not exactly for kids. So after getting through that experience, I rethought and decided, well, so with Dragon and Goat, how important is it for them to actually use profanity? If I sort of think more about who is the audience, who should I be crafting the stories for, is it okay to let go of that in something that is not just for adults, but is for all ages? And so that's what I've been working on the most now with Dragon and Goat the past several years. So really think about who your audience is going to be. This will help you shape your stories, your characters, and help you shape your scripts as well. All right, so once you've got those sort of key ideas figured out, what you want to do is figure out how you're going to write your story. So how do you put all of these things together, and how do you turn them from an idea into an actual comic? So the first step is to just write down your ideas. Write down a short script, a short story about what your characters are doing. It's a lot easier to change words than it is pictures. So think about how you can just write down what the characters are doing. So we're going to do this with the elements that we had from our random comic generator. Okay, so we're going to think about a story. We've got our key elements here of what we've got to create, of what we're going to create in terms of a story. So we've got a vampire, a jar, we've got shopping, and a troll. All right, so we've got to figure out what's some sort of story that could grow out of this. The easiest thing is to figure out where we're going to start. So what's going to be the setting for the story? Transylvania. That's too easy. Excellent. Transylvania. So we can use both the ideas. Transylvania shopping mall. Okay, so we're at the Transylvania shopping mall. So what's happening at the start of the story? He ran out of garlic. Okay, so we got a vampire. Okay, so vampire has run out of garlic. And what happens next? Not yet. Don't end your story too quickly, right? Okay, so what happens? So vampires run out of garlic. So he's got to go shopping, right? So that's an easy answer. So, and I'm going to assume he's going to go to the Transylvania shopping mall, right? Okay, so he's going to shopping at the Transylvania shopping mall. So then what happens? So,
his car doesn't start.
Okay, his car doesn't start. All right. Something else. So,
He's flying now?
okay, so he decides to fly. And that's more eco-friendly, so that's a good vampire. All right, so he decides to fly, and then we'll assume he gets to the shopping mall, right? Okay, so we still have to get in a jar and a troll. Okay, so what happens when he arrives at the shopping mall? He sees a troll struggling to open a jar? Okay. What's in the jar? Water? So water or garlic? What do we want to do? Garlic, okay. That's a good compromise. Garlic, water. Okay, so he's struggling to open up a jar of garlic water. So then we're going to ask, what does the vampire do? What's he do?
The vampire is going to use his vampire teeth and crack it open.
All right. Okay, so let's see. Vampire uses teeth to crack open jar. And then, all right, then he bursts into flames. All right. Excellent. Okay, so this is what you can do, right? With whatever you roll with your 20-sided die. Now, if you're not, a card-carrying member of some nerd agency and you don't have a 20-sided die, you can always download an app or just search on any web browser and find like a 20-sided die like generator or something like that. So you can generate your own numbers. You can also just ask somebody, just a stranger, give me a random number between 1 and 20. So that works if you don't really like technology. Okay, so once you've got your story sort of sketched out with words, some of us might be more comfortable writing it in paragraph form. This is typically what I do when I'm coming up with a story. So I write out with words, with scripts, but I also will always throw in little sketches if I have ideas of what the images will look like as I'm creating. So this is a storyboard or like a sort of script for my latest book with Dragon and Goat, The Sparktacular Spartacles. Now, once you sort of figure out what your story is, especially if you're writing in paragraph form, you want to think about how you can chunk it out. Like, what are the key moments in the story? Like, how are you going to break it down into the key places where you want to move the character? I really like flowcharts, so this is a good chance to practice working with either PowerPoint or Illustrator if you want to just take blocks and then label the text and throw it in there. An easier way to do this is to actually get index cards, blank index cards. And for each key moment, you want to write down what you're going to have happening in that key moment, and then write a different key moment for each index card. When you're done writing out the script, then you can go back, and then you can figure out what are the images going to look like for your story. So we've already got this essentially broken down with our story here of the vampire. So if we go back to our story, sort of looking at how it's broken down, and I've already kind of cheated and written it into its key chunks. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Now this works out pretty good because on the back of the comic generator, you'll see we've got a 9-panel comic. So we could just do very literally, the first panel, we feature this. The second panel, we feature this. And then continuing as we walk down the line. But we're going to edit it a little bit. So we're going to think about what we can do to condense the comic to fit it into a shorter amount of panels. So maybe about 7 panels here. So which of these panels do you think we could actually combine if we're looking at them? In terms of the story, is there anything that could be shown in the same panel? So we've got each of these. We've got the process of going to the shop, the decision to make the shopping mall trip, and then going to the shopping mall here. What's that?
He opens the refrigerator, he takes out the garlic. No, wait, his hand's in the refrigerator to get the garlic, but it's not there. So, second picture, he's like this. I'm out of garlic.
Okay, so that would work, but that's actually breaking it into 2 panels instead of condensing 2 existing panels, right? So that would be taking this one, so doing it in the same panel. Well, what we could think about is, how can we take maybe the running out of garlic? How can we show that with one of these, with one of the next panels, right? So maybe what we could do is we could have the vampire in the car already, right? So rather than starting in the fridge, maybe we could have him in the car already, wanting to get the garlic. So how could we show his desire for the garlic?
Put hearts in his eyes.
Okay, he could be thinking about it. We could have it in actual like panels. So let's go ahead and sketch out. All right, so I'm going to sketch out 7 panels here. And then we're going to figure out how we want to do that. Now, if we're thinking about the layout of the comic, so what we want to do in terms of the layout, do we want to have 3 panels at the bottom, or do we want to have 3 panels at the top? So 3 panels at the top. Okay, so 3 panels at the top, like this. Okay, that makes that easy. All right, so we've got 3 panels at the top. So we're going to think about in this panel, we want to show the vampire with the desire for the garlic. So we're going to do vampire in car wanting garlic. Okay, so we got that for our first one. So then we're going to go to the car doesn't start. Okay, so that skips us right away to 4. So then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so then that gets us down to where we should be able to jump into his car doesn't start in the second panel, and then we can go into the rest of the story. So in terms of pacing, right, if you're doing this with index cards, you can really quickly like throw out bits and pieces of your story and then reassemble them into the perfect order for your comic. So let's see, go back to the laptop here. So with your index cards, you can keep it really flexible and move things around. And then you're going to actually arrange and edit the images that you're going to create. You know, you want to think at this stage, how does the comic read from panel to panel? Do you have to show everything, or can you show something with just words? So think about what you're going to do from panel to panel, and think about the comics process. A lot of the magic that happens in a comic is in between panels. You don't have to show every step along the way. A lot of things can happen in the gutters of the comic, that little narrow space between the frames, and all that stuff is going to happen in the audience's mind, in their imagination. Now, when you are working with a comic, unlike with a movie, a film, or an animation, by allowing the viewer to imagine part of the story, they're going to be more involved. So allowing the viewer to imagine the process, this is going to get them into your story and feel more ownership with the characters. So once you have your idea, once you have your script, and then you're starting to arrange everything in panels, you're going to have your dummy. And this is going to be the blueprint for your graphic novel, for your longer work. When you're making your dummy, you want to keep the drawings so that they're legible. One of the things that I've been working on is making them so they're legible not to just me, but to other people. Because I can read my drawings and my handwriting pretty well, but my editors can't always do that. So if you think about how other people are going to read the dummy, that can help you bounce your ideas off of other people and get some feedback for your work. And you want to think about how, as you're creating, you're using a grid to give structure to your work. So let's go back to our story. Okay, so we've got the vampire heading to the shopping mall. All right, so we're going to keep it pretty easy. All right, so we've got our car. We've got our vampire here. All right, and then we said that we were going to think about him wanting garlic. So this is going to challenge my garlic drawing abilities. And if you're a little concerned about people not seeing what you're drawing, like if you think, oh, he might be thinking of a lotus, you can just have some words in there. All right, so I want garlic. That makes it easy. So then we've got him actually trying to start the car. So then we might do a close-up shot. And then he could just simply say, oh, the car isn't starting. Now, as you're drawing these, you don't have to think about, how perfect is the drawing. It's about getting the, the central main idea. So I can go back for the key for the car. I could think about a more clever design for the key. Maybe it's a skeleton key, right? Like have a little skull on the base of the key. So I could go back and do that later. Mainly, I just want to get out this story right now as quickly as possible to get an idea of what it is going to look like. So if the car isn't starting, then he decides to turn into a bat so that he can actually fly to the store, right? So then maybe we show a zoomed out view of the car. We see the windows open, and then out he flies as a bat. All right, so then he goes to the shopping mall. So if we go to 4, so he goes to the shopping mall. And at this point, we'll have him turn back into his normal vampire self. All right, so this is 4. He arrives at the shopping mall, and he sees a troll struggling with a jar. Okay, so we have the troll here. All right, and so then, let's see, so he's got the jar, and then the vampire is going to use his teeth to help. And so we might here have the jar hidden so that we don't see what he's actually opening, like what's the contents of the jar. But then here we see garlic water. And then we figure out how to show his teeth in the jar and him bursting in flames. So this would work as our first sketch, and then we would go back and figure out, so what do we need to change? What do we need to do in terms of editing for the comic? Is it really clear from panel to panel what's happening? Are there any gaps or any steps in between this panel to this panel that could make it more clear what's happening? So what do you guys think? Are all the transitions clear from one panel to the next? Or do you think we need to maybe get something else in there to make it more clear? What do you think? Okay. So what do we think for the last two? So we've got these panels here. So we're going from the vampire sort of offering to help, the reveal of the garlic water. So then what could help make this moment make more sense with this previous moment?
You could show a panel of the vampire sticking his teeth.
Yeah.
And trying to open it, and then it translates to where he's catching the flames.
Exactly, right? So like thinking about breaking it down a little bit more. Now if we've already got the grid laid out like this, it's going to be a bit tricky to do that. So the nice thing about the fact that we're working on like small scale, quick pencil drawings is that you can either cut out the pieces and paste them onto a new piece of paper, or you could just redraw them all and change the sizes. If you know how to use Photoshop, this is the step where I usually use digital scans, and I scan in the pieces, the parts, and then I stitch it all together and reshape the sizes. This way I can figure out, okay, so for this one, maybe what I need to do is show a split in the panel where he's sinking his teeth in. So I could have like his face here, or his mouth here, the teeth, and the jar. And then the flames would happen in the bottom one, right? So you want to think about the clarity that your work's going to have, but you also want to think about the expression. You know, how are you expressing the world with your choice of images, your choice of frames? Now after this, usually I just take the work, once I've got the dummy done, I take it onto a piece of large Bristol board and draw it about 1.5 the scale of what I'm actually going to be printing it. So I draw it larger than it's going to be printed. For me, I always do the drawings by hand with pencil, then I always work with ink by hand, and then I digitally will color most of my work. Now, a lot of artists right now, they're pretty happy with just sketching with, maybe you've got a couple grand you can drop on a Cintiq Wacom tablet. So you can actually, draw directly on the screen, which is nice, but, pretty expensive. So you can work most of these steps out digitally as well. Now, I just like a lot of the hand-drawn process. Now, then once I'm done with the digital working of it, then I take it to a printer. And I use a lot of like self-publishing print-on-demand printers who will actually print off individual copies of the book for pretty low cost. If you want to keep your costs like really low, you could do a small run of the book for about 250 or 500 copies. And people like Kraken Print, who's going to be here at, I think, at 1 o'clock this afternoon, they can actually help you with that. And I think they're going to talk about the rest of the process in the afternoon. All right, well, that's pretty much all the time I have for you guys. I'm going to be here over at the table for the rest of the afternoon and also tomorrow, so feel free to stop by. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is on my website, dragonandgoat.com. You can reach me through the contact page on that as well, and I'm happy to encourage anybody who has any questions about making their own work. All right.
Thank you. Have a round of applause. And please come back at 1 o'clock for our next events. Thanks.